Good morning. My name is David Lepofsky. I am the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I'm also a visiting professor of disability rights both at Western Law and at the University of Ottawa. To my immediate left is Nora Green, and to her immediate left is Thea Curdy. 30 years ago this Friday, on November the 29th, 1994, a movement was born in this building right here. We didn't plan on it happening, it just did. The very first Disability Act bill was before the House of Commons, before the legislature as a private member's bill introduced by NDP backbencher Gary Malkowski. The first day of public hearings had arrived. About 20 of us with disabilities came to watch the proceedings. As they unfolded, our blood pressure rose, because what we heard were not commitments to take action. We did not hear commitments to pass the bill, strengthen the bill, make it happen. What we heard was patronizing lip service. The 20 of us ended up storming down the halls. Somebody found a meeting room, and spontaneously, a new coalition was born. It was to become the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee. I had the privilege of being its co-chair and later its chair. And thousands of tweets later, hundreds of letters to governments later, dozens and dozens of town halls later, endless public meetings with a parade of successive premiers, ministers, opposition critics, public servants. And 30 years later, we find ourselves here today. We won, after 10 years of effort, we won the enactment of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. It was Canada's first comprehensive, enforceable accessibility law, and it required the Ontario government to lead the province to become accessible to people with disabilities by January 1st, 2025, 20 years after its enactment. It passed unanimously, and nothing happens in this building unanimously. We battled by transforming our coalition into its current form, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, to get that law effectively implemented and enforced. We are here today in numbers to celebrate and mark and commemorate the 30th anniversary of the birth of this movement. We've lots to be proud of. We got the law passed. Provinces, at least 5 other provinces and the federal government, decided to learn from Ontario's experience and pass their own Disabilities Act, and there has been some progress. We've also trained generations of new disability advocates. But the fact is, we can't just celebrate, because we come here with a mixture of pride and anger. Anger because 4 weeks from now, when January 1st, 2025 arrives, Ontario will not be accessible to Ontarians with Disabilities Act as the AODA had promised. Not even close. We've been warning government after government and minister after minister that this was going to happen for well over a decade. People with disabilities have seen progress, but the progress too often has been glacial. Government has not taken the steps they're required to take and have not enforced the requirements they've enacted in too many cases. And the result is that the old barriers that we've faced for years remain. Some have disappeared, but nowhere near enough. But new barriers have also been created using public money. Don't take our word for this. These results are confirmed in 4 successive independent reviews of the Disabilities Act appointed by government-appointed reviewers. We didn't choose the reviewers. Successive governments did. And all of them said that government after government has failed to show the strong leadership. Premier after premier has failed to show the strong leadership to make this law work the way it was intended, the way we were promised. Now, credit to 2 premiers ago, Dalton McGuinty, for getting this law passed as he promised and getting a good start on implementing it. But successively, government after government, minister after minister, slowed down to the point where our current rate of progress can only be described as abysmal. At the rate we are going, not only won't we reach a fully accessible province that we were promised by 2025, we never will. Who suffers the result? People with disabilities, numbering 2.9 million Ontarians. The families and friends of those people with disabilities who suffer the collateral damage of the barriers they face, and everybody who will get a disability later in life. If you total that up, it means every Ontarian will ultimately suffer from the successive failures to effectively implement this law. Now, I want to emphasize, we're not saying nothing's been done. We're not saying nothing has improved. We're certainly proud that we are way further ahead than we would have been had we not passed this law. But the fact of the matter is, we are not where we were assured that we would be. We've offered 1 million briefs and recommendations. I slightly exaggerate. We've offered dozens of briefs and thousands of recommendations on how to get back on schedule. Too often, our recommendations receive a smile, a thank you, congratulations for our efforts, but not the action we need. So how does this play out in the lives of people with a physical or mental or neurological or mental health or intellectual or communication disability? I want to just have us focus briefly on 2 different contexts, but these are just some of the many. First, the built environment. When you say accessibility to journalists, politicians, or members of the public, for people with disabilities, they will initially think about buildings and ramps. For a snapshot of how we're doing, I want to invite Thea Curdy to give a few remarks. Thea is one of Canada's leading built environment accessibility consultants and has frontline experience on what's going on and what's missing. Thea.
Thank you, David. In my 24-year career as a built environment accessible design specialist, I have been advising and educating architects, design teams, policymakers, and major organizations on how to make buildings inclusive for all disabled people, not just manual wheelchair users. We had a unique opportunity in Ontario to lead with the 2005 Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Unfortunately, we have fallen short. In some ways, we've even been losing ground since 2008. There are 3 primary reasons for this failure. First, our building code, design education, and professional licensing continue to resist being aligned with the Canadian Charter and Human Rights Code, or even use evidence-based design requirements. These misalignments not only create a liability gap, it denies our gifted designers the skills needed to effectively create usable accessibility. Second, failing to act swiftly after 2005 by adopting progress made during the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the ODA, years like the 2001 City of London, Ontario Facility Accessibility Design Standards. This meant 20 years have passed with new infrastructure which remains mostly inaccessible, limiting access to transit, jobs, education, healthcare, and has significantly worsened the accessible and age-in-place housing crisis. Third, the lack of enforcement. Without enforcement, consequences and fines become meaningless. We saw interest in AODA requirements waned as soon as 2015, as site plan approvals, building permits, and occupancy permits were granted without proper checks, leading to widespread noncompliance. These failures are rooted in 3 myths. Here are my top 3. Myth 1, we're doing a good job already, and if we're doing a good job, we don't need to change. Unfortunately, we're absolutely not. And if you haven't seen the AODA Alliance videos, including the past viral Ryerson Student Learning Center video or the most recent Toronto Courthouse, I'd recommend watching with a pen and taking notes. Myth 2, accessibility is too expensive. Most of it's not, especially when included from pre-design and designed by well-trained professionals. And myth 3, accessibility is only needed by a small group of people. It's already 27% of the population as reported in 2003, making disabled people the largest minority group in Canada. But accessibility benefits 100% of us because those of us not born with a disability get one as we age or through illness or accidents. There's nothing smarter, more fiscally responsible, or sustainable than getting accessibility design right. There's a lot more to accessibility than built environments, as David said, but they are the infrastructure that either supports or sabotages all other accessibility policies and plans.
Thanks, Thea. And as a another context, again, we could place before you so many, but a second context is the barriers that face students with disabilities in our education system. For that, I want to turn to Nora Green, who is a colleague and friend. Both my panelists are colleagues and friends and allies in our fight, who is a retired special education teacher in Peel, who is a parent of a child with a disability with firsthand experience, and who is a very active member of the Special Education Advisory Committee of Canada's largest school board, the Toronto District School Board, a committee which I have the honor this year of chairing. Nora.
Thank you, David. Ontario's publicly funded schools have over 300,000 students with disabilities. These students experience far too many barriers at school. These barriers impede them from fully benefiting from publicly funded education. I know this from decades as a special education teacher and from my children's experiences with disabilities. I also know this from serving as a member of the Special Education Advisory Committee of the TDSB. 2 weeks ago, the TDSB, Special Education Advisory Committee, and TDSB staff organized the first ever town hall for parents of students with special education needs. The families told us about the barriers facing their children. The stories were heard were familiar and heart-wrenching. This is not only about insufficient funding. There's so much we could do better with the funding school boards get now. So many parents told us it's extremely hard to find out what options, placements, services, and supports are available for their child at school. Parents told us over and over that it's brutally hard to navigate the school board, to find out who they need to talk to. Even if the school agrees to delivering specific supports for their child, they must navigate a frustrating, dispiriting maze to try and get action if the school doesn't deliver what it promised. Even for parents like me who work within the system, the language school boards, teachers, and principals often use when talking to families is an impenetrable education jargon. There's ample proof that far too many students with disabilities are being refused their right to an education. Principals are free to send them home for all or part of the school day without proper oversight. 8 years ago, Ontarians with disabilities were promised an education accessibility standard would be enacted under the AODA to tear down disability barriers in school. Nothing has been passed. Students with disabilities and their families deserve much better.
Thank you. Now, we could do the same with public transit, with accessible housing. We could do the same with barriers in employment. We could say the same with respect to access to goods, services, and facilities. So, what are the gaps? What's the government failing to do? Well, 3 things. First, under the Disabilities Act, the government is required to enact all the mandatory accessibility standards needed to get Ontario to the goal of accessibility by 2025. They haven't. They've passed 5 accessibility standards in transportation, customer service, information and communication, employment, and a tiny fraction of the built environment. But these standards don't cover the vast majority of barriers that people with disabilities face. And even in the areas they do cover, while they're helpful, they are far too weak. The government was told this in an independent review by a former law school dean, Mayo Moran, a decade ago, as well as by us. But since then, the government has failed to fix this. Moreover, those areas don't cover all the areas that we need accessibility standards to cover. Nora gave the example of education. I'd give another example of healthcare. The government has been sitting for almost 3 years on expert reports by advisory committees that the government itself appointed on what these accessibility standards in education and healthcare should include. They've enacted nothing. Our kids suffer as a result. But also, mandatory requirements are of minimal use unless they're effectively enforced. We have documented that since 2013, the government's enforcement of the Disabilities Act has been, at best, paltry. And that is confirmed by 3 of the 4 independent reviews that the government appointed in 2015, 2019, and in 2023. Finally, the government needed to provide information supports to obligated organizations to help them know what they need to do. Now, the government's done some of this, and there's some good resources out there, but nowhere near enough. And I dare say that far too many obligated organizations either don't know what their obligations are under the Disabilities Act or aren't worried if they don't comply because the consequences are essentially non-existent. So, what do we do? Let me conclude with just a couple of minutes on what do we do. It all starts today. Today, first, we acknowledge this as our 30th anniversary of tenacity. We are not dispirited. We're more motivated than ever. We have a broad base of supporters around the province who follow our updates and take action on them. We have more journalists than ever prepared to cover barriers when we bring them to the media or to come to us for feedback if they detect the barriers independent of us. We have, in the past 8 elections, secured commitments, any commitments from any party on this issue since 1995, and there have been commitments in every such election, are made in correspondence to our movement that was born 30 years ago this Friday. So what do? We start the plan for the next phase this afternoon at 2 o'clock, and you are invited. Our movement began 30 years ago when the government was holding hearings, and we had to listen. What we're doing this afternoon is turning the table. We're holding the hearings, and members of the legislature will listen. From 2 to 4 p.m. this afternoon, in room 351, we are convening community public hearings, not organized by the legislature, but by us. We've invited members from all the 4 political parties in the legislature to attend, and each party is sending one from what they've confirmed last week. We are delighted that they will. We have invited people with disabilities to attend either in person or online, and to make deputations to answer 2 questions. What barriers do you still face? And what do you think the government should do about it? Well, what are we going to do with all this information? We've asked the politicians to listen, and we're optimistic that they will. But that's not enough. As always, we come forward with constructive reform proposals. I've heard a rumor, you may have heard it, that there may be an election this spring. We are going to write all the parties, as we have in all previous elections, to seek commitments on what they will do when we don't meet the deadline of 2025 for full accessibility, to get us as close to that goal as quickly after that deadline as they can. And we will use the feedback that politicians hear today to fuel what we seek in our list of requests. You are welcome, as the media, to attend our event. It will also be streamed on the internet, technology permitting, and I'm hoping it will. And you are also welcome to talk to presenters at the event on the side after they've presented, if they'd like to talk to you. Our aim is for the politicians not to hear from us as community organizers, but from people with disabilities themselves. And the people who've signed up to attend represent different parts of the province, different disabilities, different accessibility issues. And we haven't selected who will speak. We've accepted everyone who asked. So, am I dispirited? No. Motivated? Yes. Like all of us. It was believed when we started that we could never get anywhere. We got legislation passed. It was feared that once it was passed that it would not lead to any changes. It has led to changes. We were told that people with disabilities would lose interest. We have more support than ever. We were told that it's impossible to make the kind of progress we want. Well, the answer to that fear is where I close. When I sat at this very desk on May 10th, 2005, the day the AODA unanimously passed, as part of a news conference including a government representative, a business community representative, and myself on behalf of our coalition, I announced that I had gone for lunch that day to a Chinese restaurant. At the end of the meal, I got a fortune cookie. Unfortunately, it didn't have a Braille fortune. It would have had to be a fortune cake. But in any event, the fortune I received that day is the message that will be our theme today and beyond. It said, every great accomplishment is, at first, impossible. Just watch us. We'd be delighted to take your questions.
David, for your committee hearings today, do you have commitments from all the parties that they're going to have representatives there?
Yes.
Particularly the government?
Yes.
Do you know who's going to be there?
Daisy Y, her office, the government contacted us and said Daisy I, who's the parliamentary assistant to the Minister for Seniors and Accessibility, Raymond Cho, has indicated she's coming. And we're delighted.
Just in terms of the January 1st goal, if we're not going to meet that as a province, how long do you think it's going to take to get to where you'd like to have the province be in terms of accessibility?
It's a great question, and the deadline served an important role because it holds our feet to the fire and gives us a measure. Are we there? Are we not there? Are we mostly there? I will tell you that there are contexts in which we should be able to make dramatic progress in extremely short order. There are a number of adaptations that can be made at little or no cost, and that could be done really quickly. Let me give you an example. You go to a hotel. One thing you kind of want to know is your room number. Not rocket science to put Braille room numbers up. United States, it's a very common practice. In Canada, not at all, except, for the most part, American hotel chains who are following the dictates of Congress on this. We don't need 5 years, 10 years to get Braille numbers up on hotel room doors or, dare I say, on elevator buttons. So there are a number of accommodations that could be achieved extremely quickly. With respect to the area that Nora spoke about, education, one of the huge deficits is that school boards are not doing a good job of just letting parents know what services, placements, and supports are available for their child with a disability. Now, they know what they offer, they're just not making it clear in plain language, non-jargon language, to the public. That information could be available within weeks, if not days. Employment. Employment is in dramatic transition. The workplaces of today are dramatically different than they were 5 or 10 years ago. The information technology we use is all different. Where we work is different. I mean, who heard about Zoom 5 or 10 years ago? The way we conduct our business is very different in lots of different contexts. The fact is that the workplace of 5 years from now is going to be dramatically different from today on all those counts and more. If we require, through an effective employment accessibility standard, not the weak one now on the books, that employers have to achieve that accessible, barrier-free workplace in 5 years, I think we get there, or get extremely close. So those are just some examples. I could give you more. So I'm not purporting to pin a year on it, not because I'm evading your question, but because I feel that it's important to break from the idea of just having a target year, though they're helpful, and move to goals that we could achieve individually to show that it doesn't have to take that long.
Do you have a sense that the government might enact some of those simple provisions that you said, like the elevator buttons, like that they are working towards doing something before January 1st?
They have not reached out to us to discuss anything about that. So if they are, their obvious partner, who's always been available to give constructive suggestions, hasn't been included in the discussion, and that's us. I mean, there's reasonable cause for real worry. In the fourth independent review, this is the one conducted by a gentleman named Rich Donovan, the Ford government selected Mr. Donovan to conduct the review. Last June, a year ago, June 6, 2023, he rendered an independent review report that declared there is an accessibility crisis in Ontario and called for the government to establish a crisis committee chaired by the Premier. But what did the government do? One thing they didn't do was release his report for 6 months, even though they were required to make it public. The Act doesn't set a deadline, but it says, it sets a bit of an equivocal deadline. But in any event, they kept it secret for 6 months. The government has never acknowledged that there is an accessibility crisis and has never said they were setting up a crisis committee. If anything, they've picked the couple of weakest recommendations from the Donovan report, ones that we think are certainly not the important ones, and announced in stock responses to reporters time and again that they're studying them for a year and a half.
I guess this whole half hour has been your message to the government, but if there's something, briefly, that would be your message to the government with that January 1st deadline approaching.
It's time to roll up our sleeves. The first step would be to meet with the Premier. Premier Ford is the first Premier in 2 decades who's refused to ever meet us. I can't say, let me rephrase that. He hasn't said, I will never meet you. He's just turned down every single request. So who has not ever met us is perhaps the more accurate way to say it. And 4 independent reviews said the government needs to show much stronger leadership at the top. If Premier Ford were to turn now and say, okay, whatever's happened, let's kickstart this, we'd be the first in line to say, let's get on with it. Happy to work together with you. If it doesn't happen that way, the chances of progress are much, much less likely, because accessibility is not just the responsibility of one minister, the accessibility minister. It's the responsibility of the healthcare minister, the education minister, the housing minister, and they all and others, transportation minister. We need them to all get directions from the Premier saying, get on with it now.
Okay, we better wrap.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, thank you all very much. And hopefully we'll see you at 2 o'clock.